Welcome back, everybody. This Week in America, website thisweekinamerica.us. As mentioned, our guest in the program, Michael Weinreb. He writes about college football for Sports on Earth, the online magazine owned by USA Today and MLB Advanced Media. He's been a contributing writer for GQ, the New York Times, ESPN, Grantland. He's been featured on NPR's The American Life, ESPN's 30 for 30. Appeared on CNN, ESPN Radio. His book, Game of Kings, won the Quill Award for Best Sports Book of 2007. He lives currently in San Francisco, and he's talking about his new book, Season of Saturdays, A History of College Football in 14 Games. An excellent read. You're going to love this book. Michael, welcome to the program. Great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me on, Rick.
This is really a great approach. You take 14 games, and you give us some history of college football, but you got 14 key games that you write about in the book, Season of Saturdays. And then that's sort of a jumping off point for a whole lot of issues in college football and in society at the time these games were going on.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to do. There's been a lot of controversy and discussion about college football in particular in the last couple of years, scandals and various other things, including in my hometown of State College, Pennsylvania. And so I just started thinking about a lot of those things and wanted to go back and look at the history of the sport and see how a lot of these controversies started and how a lot of the things that we are debating and arguing about are things that have been argued about for decades. And also just how all these issues reflect the American argument in general.
What's interesting is you say you grew up in State College, and you, during the whole child sex abuse scandal, you wrote about it, and some friends, what came to you and basically asked the question you talk about in the book, A Season of Saturdays, is why does football exist? And you really do a nice job of this conflicted viewpoint, opinion, love-hate affair that many of us have with college football.
Yeah, well, I have it in me too. I grew up with it. I love watching it. I loved going to games when I was a kid. I still love going to games now. But I also recognize that, any intelligent person is going to see that there are problems with it, that there are problems with the inherent violence in the sport, that there are problems with college football in particular, with the way the system works and the fact that they are making, all these schools are making so much money and none of it is going back to the players, and that the players' rights are restricted in terms of, selling their names and likeness and everything. And I think, it took years and years and years for people to realize that this system was skewed. And now with there's obviously a bunch of lawsuits that are happening and various other legal actions that are affecting all of this. And, it's become a very interesting time for football and for college football in particular.
You wrote this during the 2013 season. This season, 2014, there's a dramatic change in college football because we now have, I think you referred to it as the argument, we now have 4 teams that are going to be in the playoff. That's not going to satisfy a lot of people, but it's a step in the right direction. Are we going to see a real change in college football this year because of that?
Well, it'll be different, and it'll be fun for the fans because there will be this extra game that will involve these 4 teams, and there will still be controversy, as much as the argument is a strange thing and sometimes bothers me, I do like the fact that college football is an argument. I think that's part of the fabric of it, is that people all have their own biases and prejudices, and I think there will be, now that they have choosing these playoff teams, there will be a selection committee. So I'm sure people will accuse the selection committee of being biased or of choosing, this team should have been the 4th team chosen instead of this other team. So I think there will be a lot of that back and forth still. It will be a little bit different, and if the playoff continues to expand to more teams, which seems very possible, then, you wonder, well, does that change the fabric of college football itself, and does that dilute it to the point where a sport that is that has a very short season and is very concentrated, does that dilute it at all?
You're listening to This Week in America, our website thisweekinamerica.us. Michael Weinreb, our guest on the program, author of the excellent new book Season of Saturdays, A History of College Football in 14 Games. I can see so much of me because I grew up as a college football fan. You're talking about One of the first things you remember in watching college football, you're around 5 years old. It's 1978. It's the Gator Bowl. This is where Woody Hayes goes off on the sideline. And I can remember watching and seeing it happen, and it was sort of a delayed reaction on the part of the announcers. And then it's like, I think he just hit that player from Clemson. And you talk about your feelings, and this wasn't the first time Woody Hayes hit somebody. It wasn't the first time he hit someone who was an opposing player. But then this is what football does to all of us, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was fun going back and reading those Woody Hayes stories. He actually used to occasionally would punch himself in the face. That's how crazy he was. I think that's part of the inherent contradiction of football is that it's such a violent sport, and it's just you have to work yourself up in order to play football. And for a lot of us, we work ourselves up just watching football. You have to get yourself into this state where you almost become something beyond human because it's such a violent sport and because people get hurt and, are often damaged permanently by this game. And that's a lot of the conversation that we're having now. And I think Woody Hayes is sort of one of those figures who first represented that idea of football as almost like a military exercise. He was very into, General Patton and those kinds of things. And that Midwestern rivalry between him and Bo Schembechler just felt, so harsh and violent. And even though those guys were, extremely close and had worked with each other at various points, there's just something so harsh and violent about that rivalry that felt like it reflected what the Midwest was at that point.
It's interesting. The book is called Season of Saturdays, A History of College Football in 14 Games. You go back to the beginning of college football. You have one of the chapters talking about Rutgers-Princeton game back in November of 1869. Rutgers won that game 6-4. I think I had Princeton in 3, so I was able to cover on that one. But this basically, you say, football was a primitive form of hazing at the time. I mean, it was violent right from the beginning, and people died playing football.
Yeah, I mean, in the earliest days, it starts on these Ivy League campuses. Yale had this thing called Bloody Monday, where it was basically just you get a bunch of kids on the green on the campus, and they would just beat the crap out of each other, for lack of a better term.
Yes.
And then it evolved from rugby, but it was almost more violent and disorganized than rugby, and it was started by the students, and it was their thing. And the first organized game is that Rutgers-Princeton game in 1869. There's a great story about an old man who comes happening by the game and says, "You men will come to no Christian end," and that's kind of how people felt about it in the early going. And then it gets bigger and more organized. And by the late 1800s, all these colleges start to realize people want to come see this stuff, and we can make money off the people who want to come see this stuff. So then they start building stadiums, and there's a period in the late 1800s where the game becomes extremely violent, where there's this formation called the flying wedge, in which people are actually dying, and they have to propose all these reforms. Teddy Roosevelt gets involved. This is the whole reason that the NCAA is invented in the first place, is to protect these players from injuries, which is kind of ironic because over the last few years they haven't really done much to protect players from injuries. And so, that's the origin of the sport, is these kids blowing off steam, and then the adults coming in and saying, well, we're going to take control of this. We're going to shape this in our own way. And that's the story of college football up to today.
Now, you talk about Walter Camp, and many of us hear the name and really don't fully understand who it is. In the book Season of Saturdays, A History of College Football in 14 Games, you really tell us concisely who Walter Camp is, and we still have his name on major awards.
Yeah, he's essentially the first football coach. He's at Yale, and before he comes along, even the idea of having a football coach who has any sort of power is just something that people don't think of. Football coaches maybe would help organize the team or get the team together in general, but But Camp is the first one who consolidates his power and starts organizing things and helps to really grow the sport, but also really establishes the template for what a football coach becomes, and that he takes control of things and dictates a lot of things, and writes all these screeds about what his players should be eating and not eating. It gets very intense, and that's sort of the archetype for what the football coach becomes in the 20th century, where when we think of Vince Lombardi and Bear Bryant and all those other people, Walter Camp is the guy who establishes the template for what these coaches are going to become.
Well, it's interesting. We've all grown up hearing about Knute Rockne, and you've got some great stories in there. And then you say a lot of these aren't even true. This is just sort of the myth, the legend that gets carried away. Great story in there on the Gipper, who what is it? They're in what was it? Halftime? He's smoking a cigarette, and the coach is accusing him, and he says, "I do care. I got $500 riding on the game."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It was like you watch. I had never seen the Ronald Reagan movie until I started writing this book. And you watch it, and the Gipper comes across as this angelic fellow who is hanging out with Rockne's family and babysitting his son, and that's not what he was at all. He was a drinker and a gambler and a carouser. But Knute Rockne helps establish just a huge amount of the mythology of college football, and college football is just so steeped in mythology. Every school now has its own myths and its own ideas. And Rockne is the first one who really helps to establish that whole way of thinking. He becomes a legend in part because he knows how to fuel his legend. He knows how to court the New York sports writers and make Notre Dame into New York's team. And there's this whole phrase, subway alumni, which is essentially people who didn't go to Notre Dame, but who live in New York and associate themselves with Notre Dame. So that's where that whole archetype comes from. And it's pretty amazing to go back and look at those stories and realize how much stuff Knute Rockne either embellished or just made up altogether.
And there was no TMZ or fact checkers at the time, so when he says something, that pretty much you take it as the truth.
Yeah, there's no TMZ at the time. There is now, and then you remember the Manti Te'o scandal from a couple of years ago,
which you do a great job talking about in the book. The book, A Season of Saturdays: A History of College Football in 14 Games. And as a Penn State fan, you hated Notre Dame. Yeah,
well, that was one of our big rivals growing up.
Yeah.
And as you get older, you start to respect those rivals more and more. Just feel the same way about Nebraska and Ohio State and all those other schools. You start to realize that the teams that you hate the most are usually the teams that have the most in common with the school that you're rooting for. So the teams that are rivals, Ohio State and Michigan, have a lot more in common than they do differences. And I think that's true at any rivalry that you look at across the country. That's pretty much the way it goes. The team that you are going to hate the most is the team that is the most similar to the way you are.
It's interesting. You talk about a guy, his name is Charles Elliott. He was president of Harvard for a number of years, and I forget the exact time frame, but we're talking late 1800s, early 1900s. He already was concerned about the impact football was going to have on the college, and he said it produced an unwholesome desire for victory. I mean, even back then, he's like, wow, this could get out of hand pretty easily, and we might take some shortcuts we shouldn't be taking as an academic institution.
Yeah, I mean, that was the concern in the Ivy League, and it was more of a concern for Harvard than it was for Yale, because Yale had Walter Camp, and Walter Camp was pushing to make this a big-time thing. But that's the interesting part, is that this all starts in the Ivy League, and then it spreads to the Midwest, and it spreads to the West, and it spreads to the South. And then at some point, the Ivy League says, well, we're not going to keep up with this arms race, and they drop out. Schools like the University of Chicago, which was one of the original members of the Big Ten Conference, they decide to drop out. So certain schools did decide at various points that they couldn't keep up with this or that they weren't going to keep up with this. There was some talk. There's always been talk about the Big Ten. Well, we're above all of this, this whole arms race and everything, and we're sort of a different conference from the rest of the conferences. And they still say that kind of stuff now. But at this point, they're making so much money, and it's so built into their system that all these schools want to be a part of it.
Well, and you've got athletic directors, and I can't even keep track of what the coaches, the assistant coaches, athletic directors are making, but I'm looking at some numbers for athletic directors. They're now making several $1 million a year, and they're getting bonuses based on wins, on graduation rates, the whole thing. This has really become a huge business. We're rapidly running out of time. I want to talk about a game back in 1966, the Michigan State-Notre Dame game. Remember it vividly. 10-10 had national title implications. And you said basically this is when the NCAA began to lose control at that point to television. Talk briefly about why that game is so important.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons why that game is important. One of them does have to do with television, with the idea that, this game was going to be shown on tape delay. And people were so infuriated because it was such a huge game, as Michigan State and Notre Dame were both undefeated. Notre Dame obviously had a huge national fan base at that point. They still do, but it was even bigger back then. And so they decide to show it nationally because there's so much interest in it. And it was that moment where you realize that like the cat is out of the bag and it's not going to be the same anymore. And the other interesting thing about that game is that you have 3 teams in contention for the national championship that year. You have Notre Dame, which is a largely white school, has a couple of black players, and obviously has that national following and had favor among the media. Then you have Michigan State, which is a lot of black players from the South who couldn't play in the South at that point because the Southeastern Conference was not integrated. And so Notre Dame and Michigan State tie 10-10. Notre Dame goes to number 1, of course, because they have the media's favor and everything. And then you have Alabama, which also goes undefeated that year. And they are an all-white team, no black players at all, and don't get any consideration whatsoever. And I think part of it was because the writers who were deciding the polls decided to make a social statement and to, lock them out and say, because you're not integrated, we are not going to consider you for this national championship. And it's interesting how often that happens, how often, because college football is a subjective sport and it's based on polls, that it will reflect whatever the cultural whims of the moment are.
A couple of minutes left in the program, and we started by talking about the Woody Hayes situation where rational people, Ohio State fans, were trying to possibly justify the reaction of hitting another player. We saw at Penn State a couple of years ago where maybe some Penn State fans they were looking at it differently because of it's the football team. Maybe they were willing to overlook some things along the way. Well, first of all, is that a correct assumption? Do you think, as you look back on that maybe there were signs there visible to people that should have been able to detect them, and they overlooked them because it was football and it was Joe Paterno?
It's hard to know whether or how much football had to do with it. It's such a complicated thing, and it's become a complicated thing among the Penn State fan base. There's still a lot of division over that. But it does, the big question you can raise is that Joe Paterno was the coach there, or a coach there for 50 years. And so he just became so entrenched and that it was almost impossible to tell him what to do or to tell him when to leave or when to retire or when his time was up. And so you can raise a lot of questions about that and about the idea of football defining a school and how much football defined Penn State over the last 30 or 40 years, and whether the balance just got out of whack at some point.
That was really unfair for me to throw that out there and give you like 45 seconds to come up with an answer.
That's a complicated question.
Yeah, very complicated. You say that you want football to find a rational path beyond this point of crisis. Do you think, here's another one, you got 30 seconds. Here's another one that you try to rush through. Do you think it's going to happen? I mean, we've got talked now about the power conferences, and we are in such a state of turmoil now in college sports. Are you hopeful football will find a way out?
I don't know if hopeful is the right word. I am. Jeez. I mean, I wish it would, but I don't know what the way forward is at this point. I'm trying to follow these lawsuits that are happening in college football, and it just seems like even the lawyers don't really know what the implications of a lot of these decisions are, or how things might progress. You look at pro football, and it's the same thing where the NFL is this huge corporate entity, but I just don't know what football will be in 20 or 30 years. What kids who will be playing football? What parents will still allow their kids to play football in 20 or 30 years? Is this just going to be a working class sport at that point? There's just so many questions to be asked. And as a writer, it's fascinating, and as a fan, it's kind of daunting to think about.
The book is called A Season of Saturdays, A History of College Football in 14 Games. Michael Weinreb, our guest on the program. Boy, I hope we can have you back. There's so much more to talk about. The book is excellent. It's not just the history, and we talked a lot about that because you present it in such a fascinating, easy-to-read manner that as you're reading this, and it's like, wow, this is not only interesting, it puts everything that we're facing now in proper perspective. A lot of current games, including the game last year, Alabama and Auburn, a lot of issues that you talk about in the book. A Season of Saturdays, A History of College Football in 14 Games. The book is available all across the country. Information at our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Michael, hope to have you back on the program. Thank you so much. Congratulations on an excellent book. Great read.
Thanks, Rick. I'm happy to come back anytime.
You're listening to This Week in America, website thisweekinamerica.us.